I am the supervising attorney at the post-conviction clinic, which is located here at the law school. I do post-conviction litigation and appeals. Not a lot of death penalty work, although I have worked with Sam and the Capital Representation Project on some of these cases. I'm joined by an amazing panel, which has a lot of information, hopefully, to share about our topic today, which is lethal injection protocols and litigation. To my far right is Sam Kooista, who is staff counsel at the Arizona Capital Representation Project, a nonprofit law office representing clients on Arizona's death row and providing pro bono consulting and training to capital defense teams. Prior to coming to Arizona, Sam was the executive director of the Arkansas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, and he currently serves on the board of Death Penalty Alternatives for Arizona, which is one of our sponsors here today, along with the National Lawyers Guild and the American Constitution Society. To my immediate right is Angela Fairchild, who is a paralegal at the Capital Habeas Unit of the Federal Public Defender's Office for the District of Arizona, where she has been for almost 25 years. Prior to coming to the Federal Defender's Office, she was a paralegal in the trial unit at the Maricopa County Public Defender's Office for 6 years. She attended Indiana University in Bloomington and majored in criminal justice and psychology. And finally, in the middle here is Michael Kiefer, who has been a journalist in Arizona for over 3 decades, including 16 years with the Arizona Republic and 8 years at the Phoenix New Times. Previously, he has served as an associate editor at Outside Magazine and contributed to renowned publications such as Esquire, Playboy, and the New York Times. He has extensive experience covering Arizona's criminal justice system. He has witnessed 5 executions in the state, which I think we are probably going to want to hear about a little bit today. And he is currently a regular contributor to the Arizona Mirror and has covered high-profile cases, including Jodi Arias and the Baseline Killer. His investigative work twice exposed the Arizona Department of Corrections' attempt to bypass federal regulations to obtain execution drugs. And his most recent piece, which appeared in the Arizona Mirror about a week ago, has the scintillating title, "Secret Jars in a Prison Fridge Hold Arizona's Lethal Injection Drugs, and They May Be Expired." So we'll hope to hear a little bit more about that soon. So I guess before we launch into the panel, I'll give just a brief overview of the whirlwind of activity that's been going on in this area just in the last couple of weeks. So on December 30th, as I'm sure many of you know, then President Biden commuted the sentence of 37 of the federal death row inmates to life in prison. And then about 2 weeks later, then Attorney General Merrick Garland issued a memorandum effectively instructing the Department of Justice not to use pentobarbital, which had been part of the cocktail for lethal injections, because it, quote, cannot be said with reasonable confidence that the current execution protocol not only affords the rights guaranteed by the Constitution and laws of the United States, but also treats individuals being executed fairly and humanely. And so that protocol should be rescinded and not reinstated unless and until that uncertainty is resolved. So that happened on January 15th. On January 20th, a new president took office and issued several executive orders, including one entitled Restoring the Death Penalty and Protecting Public Safety. And one section of that executive order directs the Attorney General of the United States, whoever that person ends up being, to take all necessary and lawful action to ensure that each state that allows capital punishment has a sufficient supply of drugs needed to carry out lethal injection. Here in Arizona, when Governor Katie Hobbs took office about 2 years ago, she and Attorney General Chris Mays issued a moratorium on the death penalty. Governor Hobbs appointed former Magistrate Judge David Duncan to conduct a review of whether the death penalty could be carried out in Arizona lawfully and humanely. and then late last year unceremoniously fired Judge Duncan, who apparently was about to release a report that was not very favorable to the continuation of the death penalty in Arizona. And then recently, Representative Colliden in the Arizona House of Representatives has introduced a House concurrent resolution calling for an amendment to the Arizona Constitution, getting rid of lethal injection as the method of execution and reinstating firing squad. So that is HCR 2024, and that is apparently on the table in the current legislative session. So a lot of updates, a lot of things are happening in this area, and so I hope to hear from our panelists what they think about that. And although I will be asking questions, feel free to disregard the question that I ask and launch into some discussion of one of the things that I just mentioned, if that seems more interesting to you. But I think we'll start with Sam, who has litigated a lot of these cases. And we talked a little bit about the protocol, and maybe you can speak a little bit about what that means. But what are the most significant legal challenges in litigating against what is Arizona's lethal injection protocol?
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Randy, and thanks NLG and ACS and Death Penalty Alternatives for hosting this. So we're talking about the lethal injection protocol. We should probably start by saying exactly what that is in Arizona, right? So the protocol is the regulation that's promulgated by the Department of Corrections that governs how executions are carried out. I should also say in Arizona constitutionally, there was a ballot initiative back in the early 90s that established lethal injection constitutionally as the only form of capital punishment in the state. Some older cases, you can elect lethal gas, but for the vast majority of people on the row, it's lethal injection, and that's a constitutional question. So the protocol that we have right now is a one-drug protocol that carries out executions through a massive dose of a drug called pentobarbital. Pento is a medically useful drug. It has uses in, it's a pre-anesthetic. It's like part of the cocktail you sometimes get when you go under surgery. I think it has some therapeutic use as an anticonvulsant, but it is like a medically useful drug. It's used here, though, in obviously not a medical way. The protocol calls for a 5 milligram dose, which is way beyond the therapeutic limit. That is lethal, theoretically, right? The purpose of this is the drug disrupts the central nervous system and the person dies from the drug overdose. That's on the paper version. What we know, though, is that there are all kinds of problems with Pento as a lethal injection drug. One thing that we've learned over the last several years, so I should say Arizona, right now that's the protocol in Arizona. The feds have used that, including Arizona's executed 3 people in 2022 using this protocol. When at the end of the first Trump administration, when he went on a killing spree, the feds killed about 12 people using this protocol. Other states also use it. A study has been done of a number of autopsies of people across the country that have been executed using Pento, using this protocol. And what they have found, and I believe about 60% of the cases, is what's called flash pulmonary edema. Essentially, that is the drug is so alkaline and the dose is so large and administered so quickly, it causes the vessels in the lungs to burst and creates the perception of drowning. We also know from the autopsies that people are conscious when they're undergoing this, even if they visually appear to be unconscious. That happens, again, more than half of the autopsies showed signs of this flash pulmonary edema, right? So, and that is the best case scenario, right? If you have a fresh drug that's being applied, as designed by the protocol, there's more than a coin flip chance that they're going to have this sort of excruciating, terrifying, basically it's a drowning alive type of death. But we know that in Arizona, we don't have the best case scenario, in part because of reporting from Michael and other people and things that advocates have uncovered over the years. There are all kinds of problems with how Arizona is collecting, storing, and using its Pento. The pentobarbital Arizona uses is not actually finished pentobarbital. It's what's called API, active pharmaceutical ingredient. It was purchased a few years, I believe, like 2018 or so, in
2020.
2020.
2021.
The state acquired a kilogram of pentobarbital API for $1.5 million. It's 1,000 doses of, and we don't know exactly how it's been stored. That pento then has to be mixed by a compounding pharmacist in order to be administered as the execution drug. We don't know who that pharmacist is. We're not sure about the storage conditions before and after the mixing. We don't know if the drug is still within a scientifically provable beyond use date, so that we could be using expired drugs. There's a whole lot of stuff we do not know, and I'm sure Michael will talk about this. Arizona's given us philosophers to be doubtful that the state is checking all the boxes. So like that's a lot for a lawyer to work with, you would think, right? We have this thing on the best case scenario is more than a coin flip, you're gonna feel like you're drowning, and then all of these Arizona specific problems. I think the biggest challenge for an advocate representing a client that's challenging this stuff is like finding someone that cares about any of that. So I represented Frank Atwood, who was one of the 3 men that was executed in 2022. And when the state started the process of trying to kill him, they filed this brief in the Supreme Court asking to set up a briefing schedule to schedule the warrant and so on. And in our response, we raised all of these questions, the concerns that I outlined, other concerns specific to Mr. Atwood with executing and using this protocol. We supported that with scientific information, declarations from pharmaceutical experts, all kinds of evidence supporting our claim. We requested evidentiary development so we could, develop an actual record, The state replied to that to just say, no, trust us, bro, basically, was their response. So we're giving actual evidence to the court, requesting a chance to develop evidence. The state gives nothing back to the Supreme Court, just says, no, you can trust us. And the Supreme Court, Arizona Supreme Court says, that's good enough for us, right? That's the environment we're dealing with Arizona state courts. In federal court, it's as bad or worse, right? Everything eventually funnels up to SCOTUS. SCOTUS does not care about this. SCOTUS wants people to be executed. They will intervene if a lower court does something to block an execution, but they're not, with a few maybe minor exceptions, going to ever intervene to stop an execution from moving forward. The pleading standard for challenging method of execution in federal court is extremely high. The case is Bucklew v. Precythe. Basically, you have to show that the method of execution being used creates an unacceptable risk of super adding the pain. You have to show it's very, very likely this will be very, very painful. And you have to show that there is an available alternative that would not present that risk. So basically, the person being executed has to tell the court, don't kill me that way, kill me this way. This is a better way to kill me. That's the pleading standard, right? And which we pled. We met that standard in Atwood. We proposed nitrogen gas hypoxia, an alternative to lethal injection. Got nowhere with the courts. They didn't care. They didn't give us the time of day, right? So the courts are not friendly. They're not going to really, in Arizona and federally, it's very difficult to get anywhere with the courts. We thought that the executive might be a place where we could get this kind of review. And that's certainly when Governor Hobbs came into office, she announced this extensive review of lethal injection because of all of these concerns that I've just outlined. And that was the case for about 2 years, and then the election happened, and all of a sudden she changed her mind, didn't want the review, got rid of it, fired the person appointed, the federal judge appointed to conduct that review, and now says we're good to go, all these questions notwithstanding, right? So that is like the biggest, as a litigator, as someone that's trying to challenge these things, you can be as right as you want to be. You can have all of the facts on your side, and a lot of times it just does not matter, right? That's like, I know there are a lot of law students in the room. That's maybe my one thing to impress upon you. Do not get lawyer brain, right? Do not think, well, because you've satisfied whatever the legal test is, and because the facts are on your side, and because your opponent hasn't marshaled an argument or facts to defeat that you are going to win, right? Because fundamentally, these are political problems, right? It's not coincidental that Governor Hobbs changed her mind right after the election, right? These are political problems. So as a lawyer, you may not win even though you were right, and that will drive you crazy. But I think you have to be sober and realize what's going on. You still have valuable work to do, right? I think you create the environment where political change can happen. But in terms of actually winning in the courtroom on the merits, it's a very hostile environment. And that's a really cheery message, but that's that's what I would want to convey to the people in the room.
So I want to turn to Angela, and I think building off of some of the stuff that Sam has talked about, I mean, he's focused on litigating over the method of execution, and that's sort of what we're here talking about. But how do issues involving lethal injection, so your office represents clients not just when they're about to be executed, but sort of throughout the process. How do issues relating to the method of execution intersect sort of with the broader concerns that you and your colleagues have with the fairness of the death penalty in Arizona?
Right. I mean, we spend years working up our clients' claims, and it's all about fairness. And, we may raise lethal injection claims early on, but, most of those come at the end. And I think the hard part is wanting to be able to tell our guys that we've done everything that we can for them, but like Sam was saying, like so much is not transparent, and how at the end we are able to tell our guys, that we can rest assured that they're going to have a humane death. And I think that's where we really struggle is there.
And so, while you're litigating these claims, whatever they may be, ineffective assistance of counsel or other sorts of things, this is in the background of that. And
it's always in the background.
How do you prepare your clients for that, or what are you telling them about this thing that may or may not happen at the conclusion?
I think we try to be transparent, with our clients, but we also have to admit that we just don't know, and so it's trying to figure out, and so much of the litigation is this last minute. And we feel like the courts don't really take a complete, clear look at everything because we are under warrant and things are happening very rapidly. So it's just really, it's a tough one.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, Michael, we've talked a little bit about the legal angle and what the state is saying about lethal injection and the humaneness of it, but you've witnessed 5 of these lethal injections. What can you say based on the official narrative of what is going on, and how does having observed those executions maybe differ from the party line?
Well, as I'm listening to everyone here, I don't know where to start, but one of the things I'm going to say is that the less you know about capital punishment, the death penalty, probably the firmer are your beliefs for or against. Once you start getting into the nitty-gritty of it, it becomes very confusing, and I wrote a whole series about that 2 years ago, and I won't get started on that. But basically, what the government wants is they want people to come in and say, "That was so peaceful. The person just went to sleep." And as we're discovering now, that may not be the case with pentobarbital. 2 of the executions I witnessed were using pentobarbital as a single drug, and I didn't see anything, in those. But even in the situation, I witnessed a Joe Wood execution, which took nearly 2 hours, where they were using a new protocol, and I watched this, and I actually took out a pad and pencil and started marking down how many times the guy gasped, because at first they were using a new protocol, a combination of 2 drugs that hadn't been, they'd been used once or twice, and there were questions about how well they would work. Well, they didn't, and it took 2 hours and 15 injections in a situation where 1 injection was supposed to be fatal. And I watched that, didn't think the guy was going to die. I took out like I said, I took out a pencil, started marking 640 gasps that I saw during that. Nonetheless, the Attorney General's press information officer at the time, it was Stephanie Grisham. I don't know if you recognize that name, but she later was PIO for Melania Trump and then Donald Trump. But she said it was so peaceful. He was just snoring. It was fine. let me back up and go back to to protocol. I'm reading a book now. It's a biography of Henry V of England, and the way they used to execute people back then in the 1400s, they'd take someone and they'd take him to 5 different towns, drag him behind a horse till he was almost dead, to make an example, then finally cut his head off, cut him into 4 pieces, put the head on a post at the Tower of London, and then put the other parts, tack them up somewhere as an example. In a way, this is what the death penalty is today. It's supposedly a deterrent. Politicians show how they're tough on crime and so on. But what you have to understand about execution is that we talk about humane ways of execution, but it's more about the witnesses. So, as I mentioned, here's how they did it. When you get into hanging, people's heads pop off, men ejaculate. The gas chamber, people like choke and gag, and as the gas is coming up, they try to reach up, to avoid it. So you watch someone, agonizing. During the last, one of the last executions by gas chamber here, and there is a gas chamber down in Florence, the Attorney General at the time, Grant Woods, may he rest in peace, wonderful guy, threw up watching it because it was so horrible. So firing squad, is ghastly as well. But in the 70s in Oklahoma, the electric chair, I forgot that. There's a smell to it. They're fried. People catch fire. It's horrifying to see. So in the 70s, the electric chair in Oklahoma was broken, and they were trying to figure out. They didn't want to pay the money to do it. So a friend of a legislator suggested a 2-drug cocktail that was a drug called sodium thiopental and potassium chloride. The thiopental was a quick in and out kind of anesthetic. And the potassium chloride goes right to your heart, boom, stops it. It's sort of like when you have no oil in your oil pan, the way the engine just seizes up. Then they decided to add a 3rd drug in between called pancuronium bromide, which is a paralytic. It's, now again, all of these drugs have clinical uses. The pancuronium bromide would be if you have to intubate someone, if you have to. My ex-wife had a brain infection where she couldn't stop shaking. They had to give her pancuronium bromide to stop her so they could do an MRI. And so, that disguised everything. So you couldn't tell, what was going on. So in 2010, the Dale Bache, formerly of the Federal Defender's Office here in Phoenix, was in Ohio defending a client, and the state of Ohio said, we're not sure we can get thiopental. We're not sure it's available. So we started watching, and they used that to execute a man named Jeffrey Landrigan. We found out that it had come from England. It had been basically smuggled in. The Department of Corrections had been consulting with the FDA, the DEA, and Customs as to how to bring this in. Bring it in small batches. Bring it into this airport where they won't necessarily look at it. It'd be easier to bring in. Mismark it as drugs for animal use and so on. So that's when we discovered that. Thiopental shortly afterwards became unavailable, and in 2011 they substituted pentobarbital. The problem with thiopental was that it was an old drug that had been grandfathered in to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act of 1938, where if you brought any in, if you made it here, it was fine. If you brought it in from outside, it was a new untested drug, and you couldn't do it. So right after that, England shut down exports of it. Italy shut down exports because in Europe it's illegal to contribute to or to partake of an execution anywhere in the world. So it was illegal to bring it in. It was illegal to send it out. Nobody ever got prosecuted for that, by the way. That's another story for another day. So they switched to pentobarbital. Pentobarbital was still available, and the first use of that was Donald Beatty, I think, in 2011, and worked just fine. They still did it with a 3-drug protocol. Defense attorneys at the time were asking, please, can we do a single drug protocol using only pentobarbital? And we wound up doing that in 2012, excuse me, only because the Department of Corrections discovered that its batch of pancuronium bromide had passed its expiration date, and so they did a single drug pentobarbital, and that's where that started. Shortly afterwards, pentobarbital was made in Denmark under the name Nembutal, and again, it's a drug that has clinical uses. Denmark said can't do it. And so they shut it down, and that's why we had to go to the APIs. And I was able to, by the way, for the first time, just last week, get someone on the record to say that the API for that drug in Arizona came from a Connecticut company called Absolute Standards. And I've kind of known that, being a journalist is sort of like being a lawyer in the sense that there are a lot of things you know but can't prove, and that was one of them. So we finally got that on the record. But then we discovered. Now, one of the things I talked to David Duncan last week, and he's the magistrate judge who got fired. By the way, we do know where that drug is, and we do know where it's stored. It's in a refrigerator. It's in mason jars. It's kept in cold storage because the stuff, it does not do well in light or heat. And the reason that it costs $1.5 million is you have to make up to 1 kilo of it for it to be stable. So you can't make just enough for one use. You have to create this whole kilo of it. That's again something that we found out last week. But now here is this drug that we thought was the safest, that now we're discovering that it causes this horrible edema in the lungs, so that the person basically drowns in less time than it takes for the drug to reach an anesthesia level. So there are several levels of consciousness, by the way. There is unresponsive, which is the person's not moving, doesn't respond, but may still see and hear, not see, but may still be here, may be aware. Unconscious, in which, it might be like a dream state, and there's anesthetized, where all of that is gone, and what they've figured out. Now, this is not new information either, and this is one of the things that Judge Duncan pointed out. He said that here are all these states, and they screw up repeatedly, but there's no sharing of that. So there's no, it's all covered up, it's all shameful. So there's no way of making a best practices, right? So what I discovered 2 weeks ago in a story was that this notion of drowning is not new. I got most of my information from a deposition filed in Washington in a case, Washington State, from 2019. That's almost 6 years ago. So this is not new information. It's finally getting around to the point where it gets up to Merrick Garland, and he says, we've learned this about pentobarbital. We can't go forward. That apparently, I brought that to the attention of the state here, the governor's office, and yesterday Chris Mays told ABC 15. What did she say exactly? We have procured the drugs necessary to carry out executions in Arizona. We are prepared to do that. We anticipate that we will be executing Aaron Gunchus on March 18th if the Supreme Court approves the execution warrant.
And the Gunchus case is one that I think has sort of, yo-yoed around the courts. This was one that I think Brnovich had sought a warrant on him, and then Chris Mays had rescinded that, and then Gunchus himself filed something with the court saying, no, actually, I do want to die.
Can I talk to that?
Sure.
So in the 20 years that I've been covering this, there have been 3 volunteers. Gunches is the third. The first was Robert Comer, and the second was Dale Hausner, the serial shooter. Robert Comer, his first attorney, what happened in both of those instances, and has not happened now, is that it triggered a mental competency exam, because you can't execute someone who's mentally incompetent. And if you want to die, you might not be mentally competent, right? And so in the Comer case, boom, first attorney that he had wanted to keep him alive, and he hired Michael Kimmerer, who, again, may he rest in peace, died last year, I think, who worked with Comer to get this through, but they had gone through the process. With Dale Hausner would write me from prison, and one of the last letters he wrote to me after he had volunteered, he wanted to die. This is something that I think that the powers that be don't understand, that being in prison for the rest of your life, and in those days it was death row people were in solitary, basically. Deborah Milkey, who was on death row, described it as being locked in your bathroom for the rest of your life. Anyway, Dale Hausner wrote me a letter saying, what's a guy got to do to get snuffed out here? Because he was working on it, and he committed suicide rather than go through it. You can get all kinds of things in death row, even when you're in solitary. And anyway, so now Aaron Gunches wants to go through that, and here is this process. And yes, Brnovich, he asked Brnovich, representing himself, that if he could be executed. Brnovich said, sure, why not? And then Katie Hobbs and Chris Mays stopped that when they came into office, and he still wants to die. And again, I can understand that the horror of getting up waking up every day, and there you are.
And there's no competency exam of Gunches?
So the
Not
question
yet.
was whether there had been a competency exam for Gunches.
I keep asking, and nobody seems to know anything.
I think there was one at PCR for him to represent himself.
Yeah, there
I
was.
believe there was.
And
Yeah.
I think they may have just
Yeah,
That was
used
him.
that.
I'll start. Mr. Gunches has advisory council, but he is self-represented, which makes. Actually, let me speak about that for a second. So, what happened, as Michael said, Mr. Gunches is what's called a volunteer, which is sort of a euphemism for someone that waives their appeals and is volunteering to be executed.
And he has done that from the get-go. I mean, even from his first trials and his second trial, he has
Yeah.
never
Off and
contested
on.
anything.
There's been a long-standing issue with Mr. Gunches, as I understand. What originally happened is in 2021, I believe, then Attorney General Brnovich went on TV and said, look, we've got the drugs. We're going to kill a whole bunch of people. Here's a list of 22 people that we are going to kill before I leave office.
He was running for Senate. I mean,
Not,
there's your-
no, I mean, not,
that's
that
what
was
it
my
was
next
about.
point.
That's
Not-
why Trump
yeah.
killed 13 people. He was running for office.
Yeah, not incidentally, he also was, in the Republican primary for Senate. I think he came in third, so really good job, Attorney General Brnovich. But yeah, he was clearly a publicity stunt. He put himself on TV as this tough on crime advocate so he could appeal to the primary voters. He ended up only killing 3 people of his list of 20 plus. I believe Mr. Gunches is one of the people on that list of people who were procedurally at a place where they could seek a warrant of execution. After the 3 executions that happened, which was Clarence Dixon, Frank Atwood, and Murray Hooper, there were no more warrants sought by, I mean, Mr. Hooper was the third one. He was executed, I think, in November of 22. There were no more warrants sought. The election had happened. Brnovich was term limited. He was a lame duck. He was on his way out the door. But then Mr. Gunches wrote this pro se thing saying, would you please try and, but he wrote a letter to I believe either the AG or the court saying, essentially, schedule my execution. You can't do that pro se. It has to be a motion from the Attorney General, not the county attorney, incidentally. But has to be the Attorney General.
Yet.
Yeah, not yet, yeah. So,
TBD.
but
Being litigated.
Yeah, being litigated. But then so
now.
Brnovich on his way out the door, it's like late December. He's in office for 2 more weeks. Says, sure, let's just start this process and make the new people have to deal with that. I think again, talking about how this is political, that's very clearly let's just leave this problem to fall in the laps of the new AG and the new Attorney General. It ended up that he had an execution date set in 2023, and it came and went because at the time, the governor recognized that we don't have a way really to lawfully carry out an execution because we have these very grave concerns about the drugs we have. All of that changed. She had a change of heart after November of last year for unknown reasons, decided that actually things are good to go. And that is why they said, let's actually go back to Mr. Gunches. You want to have yourself killed? Let's see what we can do. Right? That's the timeline of how this all played out.
Well, it is a political reaction.
Yeah.
I mean, you had what happened when Chris Mays and Katie Hobbs said, well, we're not going to do this. Then Rachel Mitchell stepped up and said, well, I'll seek a death warrant. Well, that's not within her jurisdiction. But she brought it up to the Arizona Supreme Court, and the Arizona Supreme Court seemed willing to hear arguments. So, this is a legal problem that, you run into. It's like, be careful what you ask for, because if you lose, you are going to be in worse shape than you were. So now along comes Judge Duncan's report, where he's just given his preliminary summary. And he's pointing out all the reasons this doesn't work. It's not just the drugs; it's setting lines, which they have. Something that paramedics, EMTs, phlebotomists, nurses do 1 million times a day all over the world, but we can never get anyone at the Department of Corrections because, by the way, I mean, what medical professional would do that? Would volunteer to kill people? But anyway, I get ahead of myself. So here's this report about to come out that says this process doesn't work. It is so bad that you might as well go back to firing squad because there's less chance of screwing it up. And so, well, this is not going to work because you've got Rachel Mitchell at the door. You've got Donald Trump, who's coming into office, who is kill happy, which is why Biden commuted all those sentences before he went out the door, and Merrick Garland, they're in a bad situation, right? In a bad political spot. So, we'll see what they do. It's the first execution I attended of Robert Comer. The Attorney General at the time was Terry Goddard, liberal Democrat, who had run for governor several times. His father had been governor, et cetera. So right before the execution, I run into him at the, they had at one of the staging areas where they had us before they took us into the death house. And I said, Terry, what are you doing here? And what Terry said to me was, I'm supposed to support this. I guess I should see what it looks like. Well, afterwards, Terry looked kind of green. And I didn't get to ask him about it. But the day after, the head of his criminal division at the time called me up and said, Michael, I got to say something. We go to such great lengths to make this look like it's not a violent act. And I had to agree with him. I mean, there's sort of like this fraternity of people who have witnessed executions. It's like, it is surreal. The ironies. There's a defibrillator paddle in the death chamber in case someone has a heart attack and dies so that they can revive him so they can kill him. There have been instances, Bobby Moorman, who was described by a forensic psychiatrist as one of the worst pieces of protoplasm you'll ever see in your life, had quintuple bypass surgery. He had, I can't remember what else. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep the man alive so they could execute him. So, this is, it's a riddle to me, and I've told people this always. I'm not theoretically against the death penalty. There have been instances of murder trials I've covered where I thought the person was so horrible that they deserved to die. But it is so random, it is so expensive, it is so unfair, it is so, they don't have ways to do it, humane ways to do it, and so on, that it makes no sense. And that was the conclusion that David Duncan was coming to before he got fired.
So all of you, I think, have hit on this lack of transparency. Sam, I think you mentioned that there was a bunch of stuff that you didn't know about how this was being carried out. And Michael, you mentioned that this information about pentobarbital causing pulmonary edema was known perhaps as soon as 2019 and kept under wraps. Why, I guess I'll open it up to the panel, why is it that there's such a lack of transparency, and how do you in your roles sort of break through and try and find out that information to help your clients or write about it?
It's not just the lack of transparency. It is that people really don't care. There's a book that's going to come out in March that I recommend by a professor, a Virginia law professor named Karina Barrett Lane, and it's called Secrets of the Killing State, and the subtitle is The Untold Story of Lethal Injection. And I took issue with her, and I said, it's not untold. I've been telling it for 20 years, so have other journalists, so have lawyers filing briefs and so on. It's like, nobody gives a damn. I mean, the ignorance of the executive order, yesterday was, well, we'll get these chemicals, and and it starts off saying that the death penalty is the deterrent, that and oh, by the way, these people who got commuted, see how you can make their lives miserable, and we'll supply these drugs, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, but it's written out of total ignorance of what the process, what the process is. So,
Deliberate ignorance? Deliberate.
well,
We don't want to know. They don't want to know.
well, but I'm talking about the general public doesn't want it to know.
Yeah.
I mean, again, like I said before, it's like you already have your ideas. Death penalty good, death penalty bad, and don't make me think differently.
Yeah, we have a question from the audience.
For the attorney fairly. Well, what role does the statute mandating secrecy over the carrying out of the protocol have on the lack of transparency?
So the question, just for the live stream, is there is a statute that in fact mandates a lack of transparency.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that when you're trying to litigate these issues in state and federal court to the
Yeah,
litigators?
Sam could probably, that was going to be my point, and then I was going to say, Sam should take this over.
Yeah, so I mean, my lawyer view is that the statute isn't as broad as they claim it is, right? The statute just exempts execution details, like who's conducting it, other facts, from a public records request. The state could theoretically sua sponte disclose that stuff if they wanted to. It's just, I can't get it, but they can disclose it. That's my take on the statute. But obviously, they point to that and say, oh, sorry, our hands are tied. We can't say anything. I think it's the kind of thing where, again, go back to my really cheery earlier point, it's like we put up with all kinds of stuff with the death penalty that is hard to imagine the courts countenancing in any other context, right? Like we had this special carve out to the public records request just for these details. And there's all kinds of seedy stuff, like we spent 7 figures acquiring this API from an unknown supplier. It was delivered, we know, to a private residence, right? In violation of all kinds of federal laws about how this stuff is supposed to happen. But we just let it fly under the radar, right? Or if people object, not even under the radar, people object to it, the courts don't care, right? That is the fundamental problem with this, is that we have cultivated a political and legal environment, and those things are related, where if you're killing somebody, right, you're strapping someone that does not want to die down onto a table and injecting them with something that will kill them. And we do that in an environment with zero scrutiny, zero supervision, because that's just the culture that's developed around this. It's challenging to litigate in that, right? Because you want to get more information, hoping that you'll be able to uncover something that can actually be a forceful enough wedge to make somebody have a little bit of shame. But it's hard to get because they just point to the statute or they just don't cooperate. and that's, it's treated as
Well,
fun.
it goes all the way up to the top. I was at the Glossop hearings in 2015 in the U.S. Supreme Court, and I was astounded at listening to the arguments, the ignorance there. Elena Kagan was going on about drugs that burn you. So, Sonia Sotomayor was calling to task the Oklahoma attorney for misquoting certain things. Clarence Thomas said nothing as usual, and Alito and Scalia, honestly, they reminded me, and I've never said this before in public, they reminded me of the old men in the Muppets show. It was like, and that, Alito eventually wrote that, and that was basically the attitude. It's like, well, we don't care. These are just anti-death penalty advocates and so on. The main reason for the secrecy is what, again, like I said, what doctor, what nurse, what medical professional would actually participate in. They lose their licenses. I once brought it up with a good friend, a very good friend that I would joke with. I said, hey, Department of Corrections is looking for an executioner to do this. And it was not a joke to him. His face just went flat. It was, it's so insulting for a medical professional that you would violate your oath and go and kill people. So that's part of the secrecy. They extended that later to the drug manufacturers.
Yeah, I think Michael, you talked about this, I think, in your most recent article, that the lack of professionals who want to do this has other consequences as well. I think your article mentioned that some of the people who were conducting these executions were looking up on Wikipedia prior to the executions what they needed to do.
And Judge Duncan said, well, they're saying, oh, we got a phlebotomist this time, so we'll get a vein. Well, as he pointed out, phlebotomists take blood out. They don't inject chemicals in. So, what's the difference? I mean, in terms of the kind of catheter, and this has been a problem. It's worse than you think, because when they can't get lines here, they go in through the groin, they do a cut down. They have to cut open, they have to inject a catheter in with a guide wire up into the femoral vein to get it. Now, the guy who perfected that, Dr. Deerhoff, who got basically thrown out of, Dr. Deerhoff got banned from doing executions in Missouri because A, he was dyslexic, and B, this was pre-protocol days. It's like, here's the guy's this heavy, we'll do this amount of drugs and so on. It was all made up as they went along. And he got banned from Missouri, but that didn't stop him from working for the feds, right? And he killed Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. And then he got outed by the New York Times. Well, you've been outed in Missouri and outed in the feds. Where do you go next? Anyone? Arizona, sure. So he executed Robert Comer, and we figured that out. Dale Bache got a hold of the EKG, and it had a signature in the bottom. And I took that to the St. Louis Reporter who had outed him in Missouri and found it was the same signature. So we knew that it was Dr. Deerhoff. But Dr. Deerhoff was a vein surgeon. Do any of the lawyers here, Victoria Washington? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Victoria Washington is from St. Louis. She said her mother went to Dr. Deerhoff for varicose veins and loved him. So he was great with veins. But then what happens when you go along, and there was for a while the executioner, I don't know his name, but he was a cardiologist. And he had to set these femoral lines. That's like asking an electrician to do your plumbing. And so there have been major screw-ups that way. The worst one was in Oklahoma, where they didn't have the right length catheter to do it, but they went ahead anyway. It was a 3-drug cocktail. Started off with midazolam, which was the drug that screwed up with Joe Wood. Midazolam is sort of a Valium. They call it a amnesiac. You don't really remember. If anyone's had eye surgery, that's what they give you. You have a colonoscopy, they give you midazolam. And you forget about it afterwards, but they need you aware. It is not a painkiller. So it's midazolam, then pancuronium bromide, and potassium chloride. Potassium chloride, we know, is very, very painful, when it's injected. So here is this guy on the table. They don't have the long enough catheter. They put it in. They put the midazolam. He becomes unresponsive. Then the catheter slips out and deposits the next two drugs right into the skin. He starts hopping around. Clayton Lockett was his name. He starts hopping around from the pain. It wakes him up, and he's talking, and he's saying, something's wrong. They close the curtains. He dies of a heart attack because of the pain. So these are the kinds of, screw-ups that happen as,
Yeah.
in this humane process that we.
Yeah. This is, again, the most serious thing that our government does next to like the decision to go to war, right? We're killing somebody who doesn't want to be killed. And just the total lack of oversight and transparency is really startling. I mean, one thing that came up in the executions in 2022, I think is you had left the Republic at that point, I believe, but the department would not credential the Republic to the Arizona Republic to witness the execution. For Mr. Atwood, my client, we were able to get a Republic reporter in there, but only because Mr. Atwood designated him as one of his witnesses.
I got him in.
You got him in.
Well, I told him to go to the. I told Jimmy Jenkins to go to the defense attorney.
Yeah,
and ask to be a guest of.
Yeah.
Which I had to do in
Really?
past executions.
Yeah, so like they won't even,
Yeah.
the Republic, which is like, the news source in Arizona, it's basically, the Department of Corrections view doesn't need to be witnessing these things, right? There have been changes, to mention the cut down thing, just to mention it, just because it's crazy. Yeah, the cut down is one of the most dangerous things in these executions, is right, if they can't get venous access to your wrists, your hands, somewhere in your extremity, they will then try and access your femoral vein, which is basically doing a minor surgery on you to get a vein installed, right? And we don't know who's doing this. We don't know the credentials of these people. Mr. Atwood's case, they tried for a couple minutes to start a vein on one of his hands, and they couldn't do it, started to panic, they tried to start a vein, a line on his wrist. They couldn't do it, so they started to do the cut down after just a couple minutes of effort. And he basically had to pause them and say, hey, maybe you can start a vein on my hand. I've had good luck with getting IV started on my own body. So he actually had to direct his executioner on where to set the line into his hand to avoid them cutting into his groin to install a line that way.
I think he almost got lucky in the sense that with Mr. Hooper, the doctor literally kind of looked at his arm briefly, like less than a minute, and went, yeah, we're going to go through the leg. And like immediately went, got the kit for the leg, and came back. And of course, the anesthesia had not been put on the kit, so then they had to go and rectify that. And then just immediately started cutting down on his leg. And after that procedure, then they went over and found something like in his wrist or the top of his hand as like a secondary.
Yeah.
And immediately, and with Clarence Dixon, they did the arm first, and then went to the leg as a second. But with Mr. Hooper, they just literally went straight to the leg.
Well, and the autopsies have shown that in some cases they made 2, 3, and 4 attempts to get that femoral line in.
Oh, yeah.
So they've cut several
Yeah.
times.
Yeah.
And before they succeeded in doing that, so.
And I should say on that point, prior to the latest effort to resume executions with Mr. Gunches, the department did revise the protocol in a couple ways. They placed more responsibility on the medical professionals that are involved, and they created, they had to go through certain steps before they can do the cut down procedure. But we're still, the base problem is still there. Like, these are still medical professionals, which, it's like, again, you could be hiring a plumber to be your electrician, right? That's
A bad plumber.
A bad plumber, yeah, right. It could be hiring like the janitor to be your electrician, right? It's like someone that's like has medical training but doesn't necessarily knows how to set a line, do a cut down, whatever it is. That's still broad and vague and undisclosed who these people are, what their training is, et cetera. And that, I think, was really Judge Duncan, who was the fired commissioner that was investigating this. That was one of the big issues he had, was that he had asked to see them go through like a practice training, right? To go through a dummy execution, right? And the department kept on telling him no, right? They volunteered. You could see the part where we're like, this is where the media relations room is, and this is how we transport people from room to room. But the actual execution, they would not allow him to do that. And actually, when he was fired, that was one of the very pretextual reasons he was fired, is that he kept on asking to see us perform a practice execution, and it wasn't that rude of him. And so like there is this, even with the current administration, there's this culture of extreme secrecy and lack of oversight that, again, it's really hard to imagine us tolerating anywhere else in government, but it's rampant here.
Well, I find it's even more, do we have to quit?
No, I was gonna, if you have something else to say. We have about 5 more minutes. I did want to open it up to questions, and we have one right here.
Yeah, just from the sound of it, it sounds like you said, the courts aren't going to really address the issues that you're talking about. And beyond that, like the law allows death penalty. So there's only so much judges really can do to stop this kind of thing from happening. So it really sounds like it's more a political problem. Do you know like what we have to do to actually get that over the finish line? Because there are some there are countries where death penalty is banned. But my understanding is
Most countries.
There are states in
Yeah.
this country.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that like, how do they do it in those states? Is it just a moratorium like what the governor did, or is it an actual like law?
Yeah,
Like,
so it varies from state to state. It is, obviously there's a federal death penalty that you can be implied, under the Federal Death Penalty Act in certain offenses. But otherwise, yeah, it's like everything else. It's a patchwork state by state. Michigan was the first state not to have the death penalty. They've never had it. When they entered the union, they had outlawed the death penalty. I think it's right now, it's about, of the 50 states, I think like 22, 23 do not have the death penalty, like de jure. Right? They have a law in the books that says no death penalty, essentially. There's a handful of states, Oregon, California, where the death penalty is on the books, but there's a executively imposed moratorium saying we have a death row, but we're not imposing the death penalty on anybody.
The death penalty was banned in this country for 4 years in 1972. The Furman decision, the U.S. Supreme Court banned it because they determined that it was so random that it depended on whatever the prosecutor wanted, and if the prosecutor wanted to go for the death penalty. And that lasted for 4 years until they came up with the notion in Georgia, they came up with the notion of aggravating factors. But, by 2014, there were 14 aggravating factors in Arizona, and they backed off on them because they realized we were back to Furman. We were back to the point where like pretty much anything could be an aggravating factor. So
Yeah.
it's still pretty random.
Part of the Furman decision was, there's a narrowing function that we ought to be doing. We should only be doing this to the worst of the worst. But we have so many aggravators in Arizona that it's hard to imagine a first-degree murder that does not meet one of those aggravating factors and can qualify for capital punishment.
But there are counties in Arizona that don't do the death penalty because it's so freaking expensive.
Right.
They tend to, the death penalty tends to congregate around certain counties and B, certain prosecutors. For a while it was Pima County, and then the prosecutor doing all that, Ken Peasley, was the first prosecutor in the U.S. who was disbarred, and his team pretty much got taken out. Then it shifted to Maricopa County. There's a lot in Pinal County and Yavapai, and but there are also counties that can't afford it. And so that you might have an even more heinous crime in those counties.
Can I just give a quick plug to answer the question? This is fundamentally a political problem. It needs to have a political solution. If you're interested in reaching that in Arizona, you should get involved with Death Penalty Alternatives for Arizona. It's a statewide death penalty abolition organization. I'm on the board. Kat is our director. She's in the room. If you're on the live stream, what's the website? Kat, what's the website? azdeathpenalty.org. That is my plug now.
And I think we had another question, or were you trying to make the same plug? All right, one more question here.
I wonder if anybody could speak to Judge Duncan's plans.
So what is Judge Duncan doing now, having been fired from the job that he was purportedly supposed to do?
He told me he is still planning on issuing a report, but what happened is when you look at the summary report, I mean, people were saying, well, give us the full report. Well, the fact that it was a summary means there wasn't a full report. The footnotes in there were sort of reminders to himself. Well, all the documents were taken away from him. So he has to write it basically out of his memory. There are things that can't be in it. He is planning on issuing a report, but he can't cite those, those particular sites. because he no longer has the documents, but he's planning on doing something.
So we will see. Hopefully he is able to release something. And also, I guess we are still in the midst of figuring out what is going to happen with Mr. Gunch's, I guess. His execution has been set for March?
Not
Not
yet.
yet,
There's
not
a
quite yet.
briefing schedule,
Okay.
but we assume that's going to be granted by the court, and then the execution is 35 days after the warrant is granted, so that would be mid-March. Yeah.
So that drama has not yet played out. So we are at the conclusion of our time. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure our panelists can hang out for a little bit and speak to individuals if they want to have further questions. But thank you.